Hello again, Stay. What is a story? Most people will think of a narrative arc when we talk about stories. Maybe they'll think of the idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end, the three-act structure. Perhaps the idea of a plot will come up, of cause and effect. Maybe casual narrative lovers, you might think of the hero's journey. Some might even recall the classic 5-act narrative structure commonly taught in early education: the introduction, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement. But a narrative arc is not a story. This episode is going to be a bit complex and long, so a few notices up front. I will be speaking academically about PTSD and the grief process of a fictional character for a family member. I don't think it should be too triggering, but I'm just putting it out there. The structure of this episode is going to be a lot of building. We're going to first talk about stories and narrative arcs and how they generally apply in life. Then we're going to apply them to the Stray Kids musical lore a little bit. Then we're going to extrapolate to a higher level, talk a little bit about reality TV. And then we'll extrapolate from all of that and talk about the meta Stray Kids megaverse. For folks who are very academically knowledgeable about stories and narratives, the first part is going to end up feeling like a lot of foundational information, but I'm going to put some spins on it that will hopefully keep it interesting for you to consider and think through. If you happen to also be a narrative therapist with deep knowledge of story structure, then I'm afraid you need to give me my life back, because this is all I have and I can't add anything. That being said, Stay. My name is Lullaby. Today's songs for thematic listening are Megaverse and Stray Kids. I normally would do only one song, but we're talking about both stories and themes here, so 2 songs it is. Welcome to Stray Kids, the Megaverse, a podcast dedicated to all the stories built both for and by us about 8 probable millionaires who once used a curtain as a tablecloth on camera. You know, that's a story, for instance. Not just that there is a story there that is alluded to, though there is, but also that one sentence intro itself is a story. There are many ways where it's missing information, but that information can also be filled in by you, the listener. Micro-stories can be as short as a single word, and that's because for the majority of people, we as humans will build a story around, well, just about anything. A quick moment. You know, in episode 1, I edited all of the moments of me drinking tea out of the episode because it seemed distracting. And it was. But as part of my continual experimentation, I think I'm going to leave them in this time around. You know, urgency is a product of white supremacy. And to that extent, perhaps it's okay to have a brief interruption, drink some tea, remind you to drink some tea. Just sit. You can skip the tea segments if you really need to. But I don't know. You can tell me how you feel about tea breaks in the middle of a podcast. We'll see how that goes. Back to stories. You see, stories are part of our fundamental experience of being human. Narrative arcs, well, those are mental models that we can find broadly applicable, but are still just academic generalizations. But stories are a part of us, of our genes, of our evolution. And I do mean that likely literally. There's quite a bit of theorization that stories are a really fundamental part of how we evolved as a species. Oral storytelling has been around longer than any other history we have or know of. We have every reason to believe that oral and somatic referring to the movement and sensory information of our physical selves, that both of these forms of storytelling have been around since human language, longer even than our art, which we have evidence of going back to almost 100,000 years ago. Because stories, they keep us safe. The story of how to build a fire, of how to outsmart prey, of how to survive childbirth. They teach the stories that your grandmother told your mother of the illness that destroyed the village until they realized that isolating the ill would stop it from spreading. They build the story of how your father fell a little more in love with you every time he heard you cry. And the child years ago who cried so rarely that their parents kept forgetting them until they couldn't ever cry again. Or at least that's the theories of why babies cry so much. That, the babies who didn't cry were less likely to survive. So we developed these attachment behaviors, made caregivers pay attention to us. One of my favorite things to tell people is that a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but each word is worth 1,000 more. And yes, that is recursive. You can take the frustration of the recursive nature of language and words up with Derrida, though. We do not have time for all that right here. Trust me, I thought about going into all that, and listen, I already have enough tangents in this episode. I don't have the emotional nor time space to do a deconstruction of language tangent. More tea. What kind of tea do you like? Many people don't like tea. I do understand that. But there's also so many kinds of tea. Some of them more flavorful, some of them less. My partner is broken, though, and only drinks tea that's been steeped for like an hour. That might be the only incorrect way to enjoy tea. And listener, if you enjoy tea that way, I don't mean you're incorrect. It's just my partner. They're the only ones I make fun of like this. If you listen to my introduction episode, you know that I am a therapist. As a therapist, one of my primary modalities is that of a narrative therapist. Most memories are actually us recalling ourselves recalling a memory. The memory is just the story we've told ourselves. This is part of why it's so easy to have distorted or fully suggested and implanted memories. The way that memories impact us can be very significant. So long-term PTSD is often a symptom of interpretation of memories and stories. It's a series of beliefs that are personally detrimental that arise due to interpreting a situation or many situations over time in ways that may not align with the facts of what truly happened. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about this now. And that's because I really want to emphasize the power that stories have over us, both in how much we function by the stories we understand ourselves to have experienced, and in how much adjusting our lens of a narrative can completely change our lives for both better and worse. So one of the main evidence-based modalities I use for PTSD and complex PTSD, but that's obviously more complicated, is a modality called cognitive processing therapy, CPT. Within CPT, we tell both the story of the trauma that impacts someone the most and the story of that impact. We then utilize a process that's meant to help us interrogate the unhelpful and distressing beliefs that are motivating the PTSD symptoms. I'm not going to go into the whole process, that's not really relevant, but I do want to talk about how focused on personal narratives it is. I'm going to use an example for this. I thought about making this K-pop related, but I don't want to accidentally bias anyone to believe that a hypothetical situation may be real. So instead, I'm going to use a very straightforward example of PTSD that we can find in fiction, which is Anthony Bridgerton, specifically the Anthony Bridgerton of the books. The Bridgerton books have been one of my comfort series since I was like 19, so for a real long time. And there's many similarities to the show, but there's some big differences. One of the things that the show doesn't really go into is how intense Anthony's PTSD from his father's death is. To the extent that he has this belief that he will die before the age, I think it's the age of like 46, when his father died. And that's a belief that he holds. I will die before the age of 46. And this belief is formed due to the way that he interprets what happened. What he believes is that since his father was such a great man, he can never surpass the greatness of his father. And that includes in how many years he will live. And so many of his actions throughout the book are based in this committed belief that he will die before he's a grown man. And part of his resistance to marrying for love is how fundamental that belief is. So in CPT, we'd first pull apart that belief. I will die before the age of 46. Now, it's built on a few other beliefs, right? My father was fundamentally a great man. I can't be as great as my father was, a few other things. But a lot of that builds up into this, like the really core belief here that, you know, he's going to die before the age of 46. Within some of our questioning of this belief, we're going to look a lot at the story that happened and that he is repeatedly telling himself. So if you were going through CPT, there'd be some very narrative-focused questions. One of them is, how does this belief focus on only one part of the story? How does this belief ignore important parts of the story? And how does this belief incorporate irrelevant factors of the story? So to the first point, how does this belief focus only on one part of the story? Well, it's only focusing on the love that Anthony had for his father. It's and on his father's death. It's focusing on just the wonderful parts of his father, the wonderful things that his father had done. And it focuses just on not just his death, but how he died. So Anthony, part of the reason that he believes, you know, that mortality is so fragile is that his father, who was very, very healthy, died from a bee sting. And it's very focused on that part of the story, that it was a bee that felled his father. And if a bee could kill a man as incredible as his father, then there's no way that he could survive, longer than his father did. So it's very hyper-focused on just this. How does this belief ignore other factors? Well, it ignores the fact that many people live longer than their parents did. It ignores the fact that not everybody, but for the most part, people experience their parents dying. It ignores the times when his father wasn't a great man, and the ways in which his father was fallible in other places. It ignores his own capacity. It ignores his own resiliency. It ignores his own health and well-being. So there's another number of parts of the story. There's a number of things that this story that he's telling himself ignores. And then how does this belief pull in irrelevant factors? Well, the fact of the matter is that the age that your parents die is not particularly relevant to the age that you die. Sometimes if they die of certain conditions, that might be relevant in that you might also have those conditions. If Anthony had developed a deep, and it does show that he develops some phobia of bees based on how he reacts to Kate. But that's actually meant, in the media, his reaction to Kate is meant to show how deeply he cares for her, more so than it's meant to show an ongoing phobia of bees themselves. So it could have been that his PTSD symptoms would have really focused on the bee. It could have been that his PTSD symptoms may have shifted him in the other direction of being committed to living as long as possible and becoming a recluse, right? The age that his father dies, and to an extent, even the method that his father dies, is not particularly relevant to when he will die. But he has determined, based on his interpretation of the story, that it is relevant. Basically, he overcompensates for changing his understanding of reality. His understanding of reality is that his dad was an amazing, amazing man who was undefeatable. And his interpretation of the story is that he could only ever endeavor to be as wonderful as his father was. And in order to fit that belief into reality, in order for that belief to continue to be true, he has to change his understanding of reality to say that he will die before his father does. Because in order to have a more accommodating belief, in order to have a more realistic belief, he has to let go of the idea that his father will always be better than him in every single way. He has to change that belief as well. So this is how our interpretation of events can really lead to ongoing struggles, because those narratives continue to reinforce beliefs that are unhelpful and unrealistic. More tea time. I'm going to pour some more tea. Yeah. This tea was made for me by one of my good friends. They purchased all of the like separate ingredients. I don't remember exactly what's in it, but it's specifically for sore throat. As you may be able to tell, I have some inherent vocal fry and fucked up throatness. I also make a living talking to people for hours on end every day. I'll tell more of that story during the next tea break. By the same lens of how narratives and stories change our sort of interpretation of reality, toxic positivity would be the misinterpretation of reality to allow for denial of hurt or harm. Prejudices and marginalization happen due to stories, due to propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, etc., that uses coercive reasoning of storytelling to convince people that a group is harmful, dangerous, unworthy, etc. Marketing is largely an endeavor in effective storytelling. A pure logical compulsion, the rhetorical appeal to logos, as we might put it, is rarely effective in isolation to those who are unconvinced or unwilling. Very few of us need most of the things we buy. There is minimal logical, just pure logical compulsion for many of the things we buy, at least in, more materialistic economies or richer economies, things like that. And thus, an emotional trigger is needed. But if that emotional trigger can be built into a larger story, well, then there we can build in every rhetorical appeal that we desire. Let's look at an example. A small story we can build that uses all three of our rhetorical appeals to convince people to do something. So, Stray Kids music makes you happy. Makes me happy too, right? Stray Kids music makes us happy. In fact, music in general makes us happy. The music makes you happy, but then the band themselves also makes you happy. The band themselves make you happy, and music makes you happy, and being in community with others who are happy because of the same things could also make you even happier. The community of others who are happy by these same things agree that we should all support Stray Kids and support each other. And then, for a mere $100 to $1,000, would it not make sense that we would be multiply happy by many times, to see the band in concert? How much would you pay for happiness? Pathos, the appeal to emotion. Ethos, the appeal to group ideologies. Logos, the appeal to logic. You are happy. Others tell you that you should do something and it would make you happier. A plus B equals C. Spend money, go to concert. It's in fact irrelevant if the actual logic is sound, if the whole context of the logic is sound. It just has to be sound, assuming that all the other rhetorical devices are accurate. If the story is true, then the logic follows. So again, this isn't about, is the logic from a formal logic perspective completely accurate? Will going to a concert actually make you multiply times happier? Maybe, maybe not. That really depends on who you are. How much is that happiness actually worth? if you spend $700 on seeing Stray Kids in concert, what else could you be doing with that $700? Will this concert actually make you happier than those other things you could do with $700? There's a lot of like actual logical breakdowns that it might not add up. But if it is true that Stray Kids music makes you very happy, and if it is true that the community also makes you very happy, and if it is true that the community agrees that this is the way to support Stray Kids is to see them in concert, and if it is true that supporting Stray Kids with a community will make you significantly happier than just being part of the fandom, then it would be true that spending that money on a concert is logical. But that's a lot of ifs. The thing is that as humans, well, we are very good at deciding that a story is true. Tea break. I actually wrote tea break on my script here. I'm doing the same thing that I did last time, and I have some script. I also keep going off script. I bet it's pretty obvious when I'm going off script. But also, I don't know. I do some editing, so it might be less obvious. I doubt my mic picks up the pouring of the tea. Actually, I need to pour more tea into my... Okay, so I have a complex tea setup here. I heated up like 1.5 liters of water in my kettle downstairs. But I then have my tea in a teapot, and then I have my glass of tea. And so I brought my entire kettle up here so that I could just keep pouring water into my teapot, so that I could keep pouring water into my teacup. So good. I don't think my friend who made me this tea listens to this, but I know a couple of their friends do. So I guess you can guess who made me this tea, and if you know me through a person or not. I guess you probably already know that because I think that they told their friends that their friend is making. Anyway, you know who made me this tea, if it's you, because they're obsessed with tea. Okay. So we understand how we personally leverage narratives, utilize narratives, how stories impact us. And I mean, I'm going to be honest, I went through all of that very quickly. I know that I've been talking for a half an hour, but I went through all of that very quickly. So hopefully it was thorough enough, but I think it was thorough enough to get a basic understanding of how, in our personal individual lives, stories are really, really impactful. So let's scooch over a little bit. Let's get into Stray Kids a little bit. We'll start with what we all understand, or at least what we all already have shared context for, and that will be the Strayverse proper, the Megaverse as they put it. To be super clear, I don't understand the Strayverse. I barely have any idea what the absolute fuck is going on in this lore, and I am not convinced that anyone does. I'm not convinced there's anyone who understands what's going on in this lore. But we're going to start at that level because of the shared context and language. So this episode is about storylines and themes. So if we look at this in a fictional Stray Kids context, the Strayverse proper. So first we have the characters. Yes, that's not inherently the story or themes themselves, but stories have characters. The characters in the Strayverse are who the Stray Kids are showing in any one MV. So there's a lot of different characters in the Strayverse between all of the music videos and all of code and whatever. There's a lot of characters. The characters of any one story are the characters of any one story. So in one MV, we're going to look at one set of characters. Those characters may continue in a different music video, but within the story of that music video, those are the characters we have. Throughout the storylines, my understanding is that we began with a group of characters who then became cloned, and each music video sort of focuses on different stories and arcs of different, like, groups of clones in different universes. I'm pretty sure that's my understanding of the lore. Regardless, essentially the characters portrayed, they tend to be very archetypal. And when I say archetypal, that's a word that means things, a lot of things that I don't have time to get into, but essentially what it means is that they're very, like, tropish feels like a harsh word, but like in a very literal sense, they're very tropish characters. So I think you could do an archetypal criticism route without losing too much information. That's one of the usual critiques of archetypal analysis, is that you tend to lose a lot of nuanced information. But these characters portrayed through the music videos and the Strayverse, they exist to be archetypes. They're very almost mythic. They tend to be on a search for identity and self. They usually have some kind of hero's journey, and they are shown to us expecting that we have preconceived notions of how stories and character progression works. This is important. In music videos, you can't really build up, even if you do have lore and history and whatever, it's hard to build up nuanced characters. It's hard to build up characters that don't function on assumptions of your preconceived understanding of different types of stories and characters. So they have to, and this is done a lot of times through costume design, cinematography, lighting, things like that, very important for emphasizing which archetype these characters are falling into. The characters are essentially the personas of music videos. So if you go back to my personas introduction last episode, the first episode, if you haven't listened to that, the word personas is not going to make sense to you. But they're essentially the personas of music videos. If we were to apply an archetypal critique lens to the musical Strayverse, we could probably pretty quickly and easily bucket different characters portrayed into the classic character archetypes: the parent, rebirth, spirit, and the trickster. So, for instance, Youngbok in Skiz's film would represent a spirit archetype. Or if we were to use Campbell's archetypes, we might look at him as a mentor sub-herald archetype. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of archetypal critique, which is a bit ironic because we can see the parallels to the theories of personas. I have 3 levels of personas. I have, 3 high-level personas, the stage, the social, and the personal, which then all break down further. Just like archetypes have these sort of high-level archetypes that all break down further. So, a little ironic that I'm not a huge fan of Joseph Campbell or archetypal critique, but it is what it is. So we have the characters. Those characters go through stories, and there are many storylines in the Stray Kids hot megaverse, which also truly might be one of the silliest lines they've ever come up with, even if it is, like, I guess technically accurate. Like, yes, you're all hot, and yes, I guess in other ways that things might be hot, that is true. But come on, welcome to the Stray Kids hot megaverse. How am I supposed to take you seriously? How am I? Regardless. That is to say that there are many narrative arcs. Stories, they're both small and large. There's stories nested in other stories. Any one narrative arc might have many stories. But there's also an ostensibly, as far as I understand it, there's a unifying story, and that story begins with Elevator, and then it goes off the rails as far as I can tell. But the point is that there's still an ongoing story of diverging stories that create this multiverse. So there's these episodic narrative arcs, you know, each music video is sort of an episodic narrative arc, much like a sitcom, but there's still certain through lines between those arcs, much like a sitcom. What's one thing that's consistent through the stories and the narrative arcs, as well as the characters, is the thematic messaging. So the characters are part of stories, which are part of arcs, which are part of other stories, right? The recursive thing. And then all of that is part of our themes, is part of the thematic messaging. Most narratives have multiple themes, but it's common that there are between, you know, like 1 and 3 really major higher level themes. In the musical performance Strayverse, the themes tend to be around divergence, domination, and the desperation for connection. I'll explain all of those a little bit. So divergence, this is pretty straightforward. We're talking about a multiverse. We're talking about being strange or bizarre. We're talking about identity, and talking about identity is always talking about divergence, because when you're exploring identity, you are diverging from a past understanding of the self. Domination. I'll argue that the domination theme primarily grew after like 2019, 2020, but even the music before that often speaks to striving towards the ability to dominate. And, you know, I don't say domination in a judgmental way, but the anthem mentality, the competition mentality, the growth in the narrative arcs from like debuting together to literally fighting and becoming gods, that's all domination, baby, right? Like that's what it is. And then the desperation for connection. It's not just falling in and out of romantic love, but the ambivalence, not to be confused with the word apathy. Please do not confuse the word ambivalence for the word apathy. They are two different words, just in case you're confused. So not just falling in and out of romantic love, but the ambivalence, that is to say, the, conflicting feelings of deep loneliness contrasted with their love for those around them. Interestingly, there's then this consistent through line of what it takes to love oneself authentically, and not just for the ability to dominate. Kind of a side note, domination versus connection, in my opinion, is always a really interesting contrast thematically. Oh God, I need to drink tea in the middle of a sentence. I'm so sorry. That's okay. my throat going to be able to make it through this entire script? Well, we'll find out. Okay, rewind a little bit. Domination versus connection is a really interesting thematic contrast. I don't think this is purposeful from Stray Kids. Like what I'm about to say, I don't think that this is a purposeful contrast, but contrasting domination and connection while also having a major theme of divergence is actually super cool conceptually. It's really, you can really dig into that. You see, one must have divergence of one's own ego and belief system and values to be so focused on both connection and power. So like you have to diverge these disparate parts of yourself, the disparate parts of your conscious, your beliefs, your values, who you want to be, how you want to behave, how you want to engage with others. You have to sort of be ripping those apart if you really want to focus on both connection and power in life in general. In future episodes, we'll talk more about different theories of power. The next few sentences are going to make very little sense to the vast majority of people, but for the 3 people who understand it and the 5 people who will want to understand it more, I will say them. We're going to talk more about different theories of power because Stray Kids music and Stray Kids themselves allude to and sometimes talk to, and again, I do believe this is an inadvertent, because I have no reason to believe that these boys have done much studying of like Marxist versus post-Marxist, post-structural theories of power. But on a state of the meta level, they're sort of alluding to how they simultaneously, in both music and behavior, resist the impositions of disciplinary and biopower, while they also participate in imposing disciplinary and biopower onto a very large population, that is, their fans and others, and whether or not they actually perceive their own place in different kinds of power dynamics. And again, what power dynamics are changes based on your theories of power and et cetera and so forth. And that's a whole different episode. But regardless, it's very interesting to have that drive for connection and that drive for domination, because they are diverging themes in and of themselves, which makes it divergence itself as a theme very... This is all totally unrelated to what we're actually talking about. So I'm going to shut the fuck up about it and get myself back on track. Maybe I do need to make it, like, do I need to make a music analysis spin-off podcast just to... I'm such a problem. Okay. Like, long break. I need to reset my brain. You need to reset your brain. I've been saying so much shit. We're talking about stories. We're talking about themes. Right? I need to put more tea in my teapot. I'm going to be running out of... I only have half a liter of tea left. Well, half a liter of tea in my kettle left. Yeah, so basically what happened was that I complained. So I run a number... Well, I run a weekly D&D game. I play in a weekly D&D game, but then I also run a Delta Green campaign that we play like once a month or once every other month or something. And I was complaining to my Delta Green players about how fucked up my throat was, because Thursdays are pretty rough days for me, but we often play Delta Green on Thursdays. So like I do like 6 sessions and then I run this game. And my friend was like, hey, absolutely the fuck not. Your throat is so fucked. I'm gonna make you some tea, and came over with just an entire like quart mason jar filled with homemade tea. And I was like, you are the single best person. All right. All right, so we mostly understand how our pillars apply to the musical performances of Stray Kids. The characters are equivalent to the idea of personas, as spoken about more in depth last episode. Then there's contained stories within any one song and larger stories between multiple songs or albums. And then there's themes that create a sense of cohesion. Not that I could argue that I personally see cohesion in like this particular larger narrative story, but theoretically there's themes that create a sense of cohesion. So now it's time to zoom out. We started at the individual. We looked at a fictional individual. We looked at the fiction created by a group of individuals. Now we're going to zoom out and then take a bit of a sideways hop. We're going to talk about reality TV. I keep referring to K-pop as being similar to reality TV. So we're going to take a quick look at like large zoomed out scale and look at narratives that are like not quite real, sub-real, sub-truth, inspired by reality, rather than the purely fictional narratives or the personal narratives that we've been speaking about so far. Reality TV will be a major player in our State of the Meta introduction episode, but for our purposes right now, we're going to break down specifically the idea of the villain in reality TV, because this is going to help us, like, really help us understand stories in entertainment reality. That's what I'll call it. Entertainment reality. Reality for the purposes of entertainment, which is not quite reality. Essentially, the villain is usually talked about as a character or as an archetype, but it's actually a created storyline. A contestant of, say, The Bachelor joins the show and utilizes probably between 1 and 3 personas while they're on camera. That contestant is, of course, hoping to control their own narrative. But they really don't, at least not while they're on the show itself. And usually it'll take a number of months, if not year, after the show airs for them to regain control of the stories that the public associates with them. What's really happening is that the producers and editors, during casting, during the filming of the show, and during the airing of the show, craft narratives around the personas that contestants have brought. The villain is thus much more than a character, and I would argue that it's only a persona if becoming the villain is the goal of the contestant. The villain is a narrative, and they have a narrative arc. A combination of social engineering and editing creates an antagonist arc that the audience can feel compelled by. This is heightened by certain themes with the show. On The Bachelor, for instance, we'll see themes around jealousy and possession, exploitation and attachment, moral purity, things along a similar vein. Again, remember that the story is not necessarily about what is true. It's about what is true under an assumed premise. So The Bachelor is saying to us, like, we're going to assume that it is okay to be monogamous while dating 30 people. And we are going to assume that there is a certain standard of moral purity. And we're going to assume that a certain, the story around monogamy that we're going to tell, and the story around attachment that we're going to tell, and things like that, we're going to put that out there as the premise. And by doing so, they can say, logically, isn't this the villain? Logically, look at what they said here, or look at how we edited this here, or, they can get contestants very drunk and sort of push them in certain directions. And whether that logic fully lines up with reality is irrelevant, because it's fully lining up with the reality presented. So the story of the villain will pretty much always be about a character who spectacularly fails to live up to the expectations of romantic love that the show builds up. If we look a little bit at our, Stray Kids entertainment, we might think about the villain story as similar to the Pablo story, right? We'll often joke that there's a villain edit, or not even joke, in reality TV circles, people will talk about getting the villain edit. Is somebody getting the villain edit? There is absolutely a Pablo edit, right? And don't pretend there isn't. There's absolutely a way that things can be edited to align with the story of Baba Racha, or whatever other story you want. This is getting into state of the meta and how fandom also engages with and creates stories and then experiences stories and assumes them as truth. But that's our brief reality TV divergence, in which we're talking about how themes impact, the marketing, the story, and how that story might be crafted around different personas or completely make up personas. We've started to move back over to Stray Kids. Let's fully move back over to Stray Kids. We're going to apply our concepts of stories and themes to our meta-level entertainment, our entertainment reality. We take our personas, and yes, these personas are real people, but we don't know those real people. We are not analyzing them as full and complete individuals who we know and understand. We are analyzing the content they make for us as art and entertainment. This is also why on reality TV, you can't analyze a person based on the edit they are given. So we have our personas. We take these personas, we assess the stories that those personas tell us, the narratives that contain those personas, and the themes that are always present in nearly, if not all, the different personas, stories, and narratives that we're given. Stray Kids doesn't build a villain storyline. That would be counterproductive. But like I just said, they do have similar storylines. We're not necessarily discussing how much control they themselves have over their narratives. That's part of the state of the meta, and it's also a lot of theorizing. But how much control they have over their own narratives is not immediately relevant to the themes and stories themselves. There are many storylines that, much like the villain in American reality TV, are common in most K-pop bands. These might include a leader or a Machina storyline. In the case of the Meta Strayverse, we're looking at the Dad-chan storyline, which does happen to be one of my personal favorites, and some of the Machina on Top storyline, right? So the leader or Machina storyline might be unique for each band, but there is still a leader or Machina storyline very often. There's probably, there's a debuting and survival show storyline. Arguably, sometimes different positions have storylines as well. I think especially like all-rounders tend to have an all-rounder storyline. And as idols start to have solo careers, you start to get different storylines there. And then there's storylines that are very unique in different bands, whether it's relationship interactions, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, like Minsung or things like that, or more bespoke storylines. Chan's room is a very bespoke storyline. Hyunjin's art is a very unique storyline. The mythical creature Felix storyline is unique. I saw a meme somewhere that referred to Han as Boykisser 9000, and yeah, like, that's a storyline for sure. Oh god, I need more tea. I just need infinite tea. I need someone to mainline tea to my throat, specifically. Oh my gosh. I need to shut the fuck up ever in my life. It's not sustainable. And yet I've sustained it for over 30 years. So yes, there are performance storylines, and then there's also like fictional script storylines, usually within Skiz code. And all of those fictional storylines exist in the Strayverse. That's the whole "you're confusing our universes" joke that they've thrown at each other a couple times. But then there's supposed non-fictional storylines, and there's probably varying levels of truthiness to them. And again, it's not necessarily our aim to determine the truthiness of them. Those non-fictional storylines being the things that I've just mentioned, and a whole variety of others. How true is the Boykisser 9000 storyline? I don't know. I know that it's true to us. It's not our aim to determine if it is in fact true that, Boykisser 9000 exists in a personal situation, right? No fucking clue. And it doesn't matter. So we have these entertainment reality storylines that maybe are actual reality or maybe are subreal. These stories are thus then connected by themes. I do think that the meta Strayverse has very different themes than the fictional Strayverse, than the musical Strayverse. If I were to narrow down the meta themes that we see, I would argue that there are two major overarching themes, and those are found family and hard work. That's not to say that those are the only themes by any means, and there might be others that y'all think of that feel very universal to these non-fictional storylines. Definitely be interested in hearing what those are. But the ones that I see, the ones that I think are the two that we're going to find in just about every context: found family and hard work. I think that if we're looking at like every single context that we see any of the Stray Kids, so whether it's lives or behind the scenes footage or whatever, I think that found family is a little bit more universal than hard work, but I can't really think of many pieces of content off the top of my head that don't include both. I think they're both pretty ubiquitous. I would personally put a lot of Stray Kids' success down to their very strong found family theming. Found family storylines are super powerful motivators for parasocial relationship development. especially in increasingly lonely societies. And that overlap of found family and hard work speak really, really directly to both the culture that was developed from historical and modern Korean Confucianism and how prevalent Christianity is in Southern Korea. In addition, when we are thinking about found family, we also often end up incorporating softer views of masculinity, which sells very, very well to predominantly female audiences and audiences that internationally and maybe intranationally as well. I don't know a ton about the demographics of Southern Korea K-pop fans, but internationally, I know tend to be very queer. I have like 2 to 3 hours of content on queerness in development for an early State of the Meta episode, so I won't elaborate much further on that here. But yes, soft masculinity, found family is really strong, just like across identity spectrums. Hard work is a pretty consistent K-pop theme, and that's partially because it's a huge value in Southern Korea. American audiences and even more so many Western European cultures are more likely to really value the artistic creation process. So, for instance, let's take Arcane or the Spider-Verse movies. Allowing the process of that creation requires being quite patient with the process. Not saying that it's not hard work. It absolutely is hard work, but it requires a lot of breadth and space and patience and time and letting an artistic process look like whatever it needs to look like to heighten excellent artistry. But there's a much higher expectation of content and marketing and selling within the K-pop industry, which is to say that there's a much higher expectation of, hard work, not necessarily looking like eventual excellence, but hard work looking like excellence quickly. Hard work looking like productivity, rather than hard work looking like, look at this small but truly mind-blowing piece of art. And it is considered virtuous to not just work hard, but to enjoy working hard and enjoy working a lot. That idea of virtuosity is also seen in many cultures, and that virtuosity of enjoying your work, but it's very, very strong there. But this theme isn't just seen in musical productivity, unfortunately. We also see it in, say, how they talk about their bodies and expectations for their bodies. We see it in their hobbies. We see it in their promises. Themes are really interesting. Themes start to bridge intentional storylines and the state of the meta, and how the various systems we exist in might be impacting us and our intentions more than we realize. How the values of our culture impact the stories we tell ourselves and to each other. Found family and hard work is very marketable. It's part of why it's so universal. Now, I think Stray Kids seems to really, really believe in their found family and be really, truly dedicated to their work. It's not my aim to assume personal lives, but I do think that seems very authentic. It's part of why we love them so much. But I'm not sure how intentional from all their perspectives it is that these themings are in every single thing they do, because they are in every single thing they do. Our next episode is going to be the introduction to the state of the meta. And we're going to talk a lot about how reality TV manages to create specific storylines regardless of the individuals involved or their active, informed consent. I'm also recording this episode just a few days after the VCHA lawsuit has dropped, and we cannot ignore that. So I'm going to talk a lot about how we can apply the understanding of the manipulation of reality TV to stray kids themselves, as well as the psychological impact of the pressures, not just that trainees have, but that stray kids in particular had due to their unique circumstances. And we'll have the opportunity to keep exploring where those values of chosen family and hard work might be intentional, unintentional, or truly authentic. And when they are authentic, how much of that authenticity may have been created or developed or manipulated, or in the worst circumstances, fully coerced. I think it's going to be a very hard episode. It's been a hard episode for me to start writing. It's going to be a hard episode for me to record. But it's the crux of it all. So that's what's going to be coming up next. Have you figured out why I chose Stray Kids as our song for this episode yet, Stay? The song Stray Kids, it really is a fourth wall break. It pulls together, it's them telling their own story of the music they've made, but also of themselves. And it's also telling us a story about our experiences with them. Stray Kids as a song is a meta-analysis of themselves, which is very cool. Stay, that's all I have for tonight. Or today. It's nighttime when I'm recording this. You know what I'm saying. If you would like, you can find me on Instagram and Threads. I'm also going to make a YouTube channel, and probably by the time I release this, I'll have the YouTube channel out. You can find me under MEGAVERSE in all of those places. I've been really enjoying Threads thus far. It's a very sweet community. Stay. I hope if you have been enjoying these episodes or enjoy any of my thoughts on Threads, that you are interested in returning, because you see, without you, my universe is not mega. Oh no, that didn't. I really thought I could confidently go with that ad lib as I started saying it, and then it sounded really stupid, just like all of these do. Because mega is it's so cringe. What a cringe word to just use. You see, if Ultra was the song that I had used, I could, but that's like, it's too late for that. I already, Stray Kids and Megaverse are my song. Well, per usual, this is an incredible sign off. Goodbye.